Good morning to all. Welcome to our masterclass. We are very honored this morning to have our President and Rector, Michael Ignatieff, with us, and he will give introductory remarks to this very important day for the Center of Religious Studies. Thank you, Michael, for being with us, and I give you the floor right now.
Thank you, Professor Fabiani. I have a few notes, so I'll just kind of go to those. I'm tremendously pleased that the Center for Religious Studies is doing this masterclass, because blasphemy is a deeply troubling and difficult subject for an old liberal like me and for liberal democratic societies in general. One of the best guides to these difficulties is David Nash's Acts Against God, which I looked at again yesterday, and I'm so delighted he can be here with us today, because he really is a peerless guide to the long legislative history, particularly of the blasphemy laws in European societies and the history of their abolition, the history of the struggle over them. And it's a tremendously important contribution. And so it's great to have him here. And I've learned a lot from his work. And I learned particularly from a sense of blasphemy as an act against God, not just a belief, not just an opinion, but an act, and an act not just against believers, but against God, him or herself. And I think that's an important idea. The idea of an act against God then leads very quickly to something else, which is an attack against God is also an attack on God's sanctioned rulers. And as David Nash points out, blasphemy and sedition have been linked historically for millennia. To attack God is to attack his lawful rulers here on earth, and the close links between church and state made blasphemy an extremely important matter of state for millennia. And I think that illustrates something that we forget about the coming of liberal democracy as an idea in the 17th and 18th centuries, that it's an attempt to secularize legitimacy by establishing the ultimate sovereignty in the people rather than in any divinely ordained ruler. And the formation of modern liberal democracy is crucially rests on this idea that all legitimacy is secular. And this then produced the separation of church and state and the American Constitution and other documents. But this is only one solution to the problem of authority. And other theocratic states, Iran being the most obvious example, but other states around the world have not separated, have not secularized power in the ways that the West has done. And this is, I think, come back to haunt the discussions that we've had since the Rushdie affair of 1989. By the way, the Rushdie affair is very personal to me, because I have been and am a friend of Salman and was there on the very day when he was whisked into hiding in February 1989 and followed the whole story. And David Nash's account of this at the end of his book is a very good and sobering guide to the illusions on the liberal side and the ferocity on the in the multicultural communities that were outraged or persuaded to be outraged by the Rushdie affair. But I think one of the things that I learned from that affair and also from thinking about blasphemy is some of the weaknesses of the liberal set of assumptions about religion. Once you disestablish religion, once you secularize legitimacy, once you separate church and state, you're doing so for a very important reason, which is to take the poison of religious fanaticism out of politics. And when you've done that, you hope to have rendered religion harmless. That is, you hope to construe religion simply as a set of opinions and beliefs like any other. And that's precisely the contention that the idea of blasphemy rejects. Religious belief is not just another set of opinions or beliefs. It has a privileged and central status in the identity and meaning of a whole human life. And I think liberals have been slow to understand that that assumption behind blasphemy. The liberal ascendancy has seen the abolition of the blasphemy laws, and David Nash charts that story very clearly, and we've given in its place priority to free expression. It might even be said that we've made free expression a sacred substitute, so that the only thing that's sacred is the right to have an opinion and express it freely. I hope we haven't sacralized rights. I hope we haven't sacralized the right to have an opinion and express it freely, but sometimes that's the way it can feel to our non-liberal competitors. And the toleration that liberals have accorded to religion, I think, depends on the premise that religion is essentially harmless. It's just another opinion and belief. And so insulting someone's creedal beliefs is no more serious than insulting their dress or their hairstyle or something. I was raised in a Canadian liberal family to believe, my mother told me, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. A sentence which I have a feeling is deeply untrue. And we discovered just how untrue this was, I think, in the Rushdie affair in 1989. Certainly it was a wake-up call for me. The liberal assumption that religion is a harmless belief, just a creedal opinion, was simply not true to many members of the multicultural communities of the United Kingdom, where I was living at the time. In those communities, religion is not a belief, it's an identity. The identity rests on the premise that the believer is protected by God, and in turn, the believer protects God from blasphemy. And because blasphemy harms God, believers must defend God, because to defend God is to defend themselves, their honor, their identity, and their faith. I spent a lot of time in Muslim communities in Bradford in the spring of 1989 and heard this kind of view constantly. These identity commitments were then politicized by a bunch of agitators and intriguers of various kinds, but there's no doubting the sincerity of this belief that that blasphemy was an attack on something so fundamental to them that it had to be resisted, if necessary, with violence. And from this period of the Rushdie affair, I think we can date a whole new period in the history of the liberal democratic encounter with religion. It's been a politics of provocation ever since. The cartoons of the Danish newspaper, the counter provocations, the attacks on the Danish newspaper, the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, the disgusting massacre of the cartoonists. We allow one provocation, that is the expression of disrespectful opinions towards religion, and we punish the other, that is the counterattacks, for the very good reason that these attacks ended up in murder and are a threat to religious and secular people alike. But my point here is that I think the whole discussion and consideration of blasphemy, if you're a liberal Democrat like me, lays bare a lot of liberal illusions. It lays bare the illusion that we live in a fully secularized society, that we all agree that religion is a harmless opinion or belief like any other. We've learned instead that religions are identities, commitments, ways of living, that those who hold those faiths believe must be defended against attack. And these communities believe that blasphemy does exist and is an attack upon God. And where this leaves a liberal is in a difficult place, because a liberal doesn't believe in a domain called the sacred. And we do not respect belief in, we do not accord respect to belief in the sacred. We accord respect to arguments that can be rationally demonstrated and proved, and needless to say, religious convictions are not of that character. So we tolerate the sacred beliefs of others, but we do so really for prudential reasons in the name of civil peace, not because we have intrinsic respect for these commitments. And I think that may be a mistake. I think we should. And then how would that occur on the basis of liberal premises? I have a feeling on the premise of humility. One of the strengths of liberalism, I hope, is a humility about human life, humility about the incommensurability of good lives, which means something quite clear. There are many ways to live a good human life. Religious lives based on creedal faith, are one of those good lives. There's no one rational standard of a good life, and that is, I think, one of the strengths of liberalism. And on that basis, religious lives have as good a claim to respect as a good life as any secular one. And I think that's, in a sense, what I take from the Rushdie affair. It is appropriate for us to criticize what we call fanaticism, to criticize the violence to which it leads. It is appropriate to question the credibility of religious doctrine. But we are faced with a life that escapes the rational premises of liberal skepticism. And we can't build a liberal democratic society unless we acknowledge and respect the incommensurability of these claims. I hope this helps to get us started. I will stop here. This is just my way of saying, how terrific it is that we're doing this masterclass today, how terrific it is that the Center for Religious Studies is doing this, and how terrific it is to have David Nash and so many other senior colleagues, Aziz and Nadia and Professor Fabiani with us leading this discussion. And I wish I could be with you longer. I'm afraid I have a long and difficult Senate meeting, so I won't be able to stay with you, but I wish the day every success. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michael, Mr. Rector, for this beautiful introduction that is at the heart of our questioning today. So I wish you the best for your very heavy day with the Senate meeting. And I think everybody is very pleased with your introductory remarks. Very good start for a very long day. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. So we are now starting this very long day. Of course, we will have two outstanding keynote speakers, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And in spite of the difficulties inherent to the Zoom system, we will try to make all what is possible to keep the atmosphere of a seminar with active participants. So the rule of the game is the following. We will have 1 hour for each speaker, okay, for a full lecture. Then a little intermission, little break, unfortunately without coffee or tea offered by the house, but it will allow you to have a little rest. And after 15 minutes, we will reconvene. And Nadia in the morning and I in the afternoon will moderate the discussion with panelists who are either PhD students or young PhDs, and we have a lot of questions to ask our speakers. And when we are done with this first round of questions, we will, of course, open the floor to everyone. So as for the moderator, Nadia in the morning and me in the afternoon, it's sometimes difficult to see the hands raised, the yellow hands. So please just use the chat box to everyone. Send a message to everyone asking for the floor without your question, just plainly asking for the floor. And I think it will be the best way to, receive as many questions as we can, because I'm sure that the lectures will trigger a lot of questions, and maybe in the way shown by Michael Ignatieff, but also in many other respects. So welcome again. Okay, I would like to thank particularly Esther Holbrook, who is the Zoom magician, who allows us to be together. And now I think we can move. We have a few minutes, extra minutes, but I suggest that we move slowly to the first lecture. So the first lecture is a lecture by our friend and colleague, the founder of the Center of Religious Studies, which proved to be an excellent endeavor over time, because we have now 10 departments working with the center. We have a lot of scholars involved in this very rich object, an encompassing object, that is absolutely uppermost, of course, for a school like us. And we will also, this is breaking news, we will also participate in the BA program in the future, because religion matters, of course. So the first lecture is by Aziz, but Aziz will be introduced by Nadia Al-Baghdadi, but I must now, of course, introduce Professor Nadia Al-Baghdadi, who is also one of the founders of the Center for Religious Studies. And I'm absolutely delighted that she is here today to moderate the first session, the morning session of our masterclass. Nadia, you all know her, I think, is a historian of modern Islamic history, particularly 19th century history. And she has a particular interest in religion, but also gender and modernity. And the association of gender and religion, of course, is very, very important in her work and makes it central in the current debate. She is the director of the Institute for Advanced Study that is linked to CEU, that is in Budapest. And this is a wonderful institute. And she has done a splendid work with the institute, which is one of the best in Europe, but maybe also in the world. And I think we have some fellows from the center today. She's also the co-director of the outstanding international research program that is titled Striking from the Margins, supported by the Carnegie Corporation, Carnegie Foundation. And this Striking for the Margins program, and Aziz Al-Azmeh is also associated, of course, is really what we can do, the best at CEU, and it unites a lot of young scholars for all over the world. And I think it's a great pleasure to host it at the Center for Religious Studies. So for all these reasons, Nadia Al-Baghdadi is the best moderator for the morning session. So thank you, Nadia. Thank you again. And I give you the floor for the first moment in our great day. Nadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, and I'm glad we are on Zoom, so you don't see me blush for your very kind words. Good morning to everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces of old and some people who are around, but so it's wonderful, and it's really, it would be so great if we were sitting together in the same room and we could have, as in good old days, shaken hands and say hello, because we're spending a long day together, and we're not only spending a long day together, but we are also discussing a topic that, as a rector already introduced in his opening remarks, requires us actually not only to rethink in old long the resilience of a notion, of a concept, of a practice, but also to take a certain stance, right? It is something that we don't look at only in an abstract manner and fashion, but it is something I think many of you would agree is something which forces us to take a position, not necessarily a black and white position, but something, as was also indicated in the opening, and I trust we will hear more by our two distinguished keynote speakers, to rethink constantly. Therefore, I'm really happy that we and pleased to have a whole day today with you in a classroom fashion. There we'll have two keynotes indeed, but the invitation is to discuss and to make and to use the Zoom classroom meeting as productive as possible. My task here is not to lecture you, but to introduce our speaker and to moderate later the panel. And listening again to both Jean-Louis and Michael, it is evident now that it makes very much sense to start a masterclass on blasphemy and the resilience of an idea with a perspective that derives from Muslim history at large in a very general compass. I don't say the Arab world, which is the expertise of our first keynote speakers, but the Muslim world at large. The mentioning of the Rushdie affair as being indeed a watershed mark, not only with regard to the reaction and the impact of what is considered to be blasphemous, certainly left a mark that went across not only then the Anglo-Saxon world where the book was published that caused the outcry, but it had a tremendous impact far beyond. So it's therefore my very great pleasure to introduce Aziz Al-Azmeh, who is, I think in this circle doesn't really deserve, but doesn't need a long introduction. His work and his contributions in the scholarly as well as in the public domain are known to many of you. I will therefore, with his permission, keep the introduction rather short. His work, and this is also speaks very much for the master class and why the invitation was given to Aziz, is that his work indeed covers Islamic history and thought from late antiquity to the modern or the current postmodern or post-colonial world, if I make resonance to his title. And he places that history, and this is where blasphemy, of course, comes in, although it rarely figures as a central key notion in his work. It's at the intersection of politics, religion, and culture. Politics, religion, and culture, seeing both, as some of you may know his work, late antiquity and others. This is about kingship, forms of governance and sovereignty, the question of legitimacy within the Muslim context, be it imperial, pre-nation or post-nation states, that I say with reference to the mentioned Striking from the Margins project that we actually run currently in its second phase. So there is a lot of resonance in his work to the concept and the notion we are dealing with today, blasphemy, without being at the center of the work. I will nevertheless, and therefore, mention a few works that come from, that were published in both the main languages of a scholarly output, in Arabic and in English. I have a huge CV with me that I will not go through, but I want to mention the works that I think you will find interesting as well, apart and beyond the texts that were distributed to you in preparation for the masterclass. So with this very first work that were published in 1981, which is still a classic, this is why I mention it, Ibn Khaldun in Modern Scholarship, which was published in London in 1981 and saw then other imprints thereafter. He set a tone precisely to see where the intersection is of religion and politics and culture, and relates, although there is no, if you would search in the indexes, no reference to this, but there clearly are explanatory models that help us understand why is indeed blasphemy and a sister notion, heresy, such an important issue politically and culturally in the Muslim Arab world. Another text and another book that I think resonates very well with what we are doing today is the 1991 published Arabs and Barbarians, Medieval Arabic Ethnology and Ethnography, published in Arabic, second imprint in process and in press, a book published immediately thereafter, and that resonated very strongly, and we will probably touch upon that during today's day, is the 1992 Secularism in Modern Arab Life and Thought, published initially also in Arabic, but then found various ways coming into English, and not only English translation to us. I will not mention them all, but mention the 2020 Edinburgh University Press text on secularism, or book on secularism in the Arab world, context, ideas, and consequences. The one book that I should also mention, and I will stop here and haven't mentioned them all, is the 1997 Muslim Kingship, Power and the Sacred in Muslim, Christian and Pagan Politics, which obviously has or builds a fertile ground for our discussions. In recognition of his contribution to both the Anglo-Saxon academic world as well as the Arab world, he has been offered a number of honorary distinctions. I mention only one and keep out all the others. It's the 1993 Order of Merit for Services to Arab Culture, which was offered by the Republic of Tunisia. And I will just mention indeed that the act, and that is also my own personal contribution here, when in the early 2000s, or in the mid 2000s, the Center for Religious Studies was founded at Central European University. There were quite a few people who said, why do we need a Center for Religious Studies? This is a world where religion doesn't really play an important role anymore, and is particularly not in this part of the world, the former Eastern part, let's put it this way, with the various political and other regimes prior to 1991. It very quickly became clear that indeed religion and politics, religion and culture is something that requires our attention, and Aziz has done a lot to place it in in a context and in intersections that proved and convinced, I would say, many who were doubtful that we should put religion still and again at the forefront to be a useful enterprise. And therewith now, without any further ado, I would like to thank Aziz again for offering the first keynote lecture of the day and give the floor to you. The agreement is that he will speak for about an hour or so. As Jean-Louis said, we will have the opportunity to grab a coffee thereafter and then move to the panel and discussions. Aziz.
Thank you very much indeed, Nadia. This was very generous, very generously put. Just one prefatory word about religion and the interest in religion. My relationship to religion is quite simple. I view it as a natural historian views nature, with the same dispassionate distance, but with the same fascination. Just so that this particular matter is clear before I start. And as for blasphemy, I will take David Nash's, what he calls his rudimentary definition of blasphemy as, and I quote, the willful use of derogatory language or actions that question the existence, nature, or power of sacred beings, items, or texts. Now, I would add to this definition only, I mean, this definition is, of course, focused on avowals of the cognitive type. I would add that the rhetoric and semiotics of blasphemy, including those of indirection, are really of equal moment in the making of the particular phenomenon. And this actually works by two ways. Blasphemy works in two ways. One type of blasphemy actually is parodic irony. It's parodic irony as illustrated by the signature image of this particular masterclass, which we will come to in a minute. And the other is by satire. Now, satire works by the exaggeration and simplification of one or more elements, or the parodying of one or more elements in the object satirized. Visual satire takes the form of caricature, such as a cartoonist giving a Jew or an Arab a huge hooked nose. Now, both of these elements of ironic parody and of satire are evident in the two major episodes that I want to speak about this morning, namely that of Rushdie's Satanic Verses and the cartoons of Charlie Hebdo in France. Now, quite very briefly, a comment on the blasphemous prototype, which is the signature of this particular masterclass. Esther, may we see the first image, please? This is the Blessed Virgin chastises the infant Jesus in front of three witnesses. Now, the interesting thing here is that, first of all, it is composed, it's almost a collage of various Renaissance devotional paintings. There are references to Parmigiano in the sense of the proportions of Mary's body, Raphael in the colors and clothing of Mary. And of course, if you were to take a look at Mary's raised arm, this energy of the raised arm is almost picture perfect copy of Christ in the Sistine Chapel announcing the coming of the last judgment. So the blasphemous intent, really, this blasphemous intent by means of humanization, where the Son of God is, or God the Son rather, is receiving corporal punishment from his mother and being thereby humiliated in the same way that he was to be humiliated at the end of time when he was put on the cross, which was the punishment of thieves and outlaws. That, of course, this profanation created quite a scandal. And the image, when it was first portrayed in 1926, exhibited, was removed. The Bishop of Cologne pronounced an excommunication against the artist in Cologne Cathedral in the presence of the artists' parents. And then, of course, as a result, this was reproduced in this foundational book of the surrealist movement, La Révolution Surréaliste, which was as an expressly and quintessentially blasphemous work of art. Now, this image conforms to all the terms of reference of the definition of blasphemy as profanation and sacrilege, which is stated, for instance, in the Catholic Encyclopedia definition of the particular phenomenon. I will, and using incidentally terms which are different to the terms of legal language, the legal formulation of sacrilege and of blasphemy, for which matter I shall defer entirely to David Nash, who knows these matters better than most of us. Now, it did not stop in 1926, because in 2005, when this particular painting was exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, it had to have specially protective glass for fear of vandalism by evangelical Christians in the United States. What this actually brings to mind is that after such a very long period of the abeyance of issues related to blasphemy, there was a reinstatement of the relevance of the term associated with religious movements which are prepared to mobilize on the street, and not, as had been the case before, with the issues of blasphemy confined to legal process rather than to rioting on the streets. That is, of course, in a situation where blasphemy is committed every day and is really quite an unremarkable thing, be it because blasphemy, that is to say, implicitly acting as if religious taboos did not exist, is part and parcel of all modern social and political orders. In that sense, it can be reproached for blasphemy, but it has not been reproached for blasphemy, except under very specific circumstances, which I will talk about this morning. That is to say, when blasphemy is indicated and when stones are thrown outside the confined surroundings of either restricted fields of communication for particular pieces of art or of literature, or involving mass mobilization on the street. Now, this is why the furor following the satanic verses in 1989, 1990 was so very much unexpected. Although most of the commentators said that it ought to have been expected. And I will tell you why I think this actually is not really the way to look at what had actually happened. Now, what I'm going to maintain is that the Rushdie affair, the affair around the book, The Satanic Verses, and the affair around the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, and various things in between, including cartoons elsewhere, be it in Denmark, other pieces of art in the Netherlands and elsewhere, and accompanying rioting and murder and various acts, various physical attacks, are all part of one continuous context in which the Rushdie affair is the foundational event, and the Charlie Hebdo is the natural consequence, given the nature of these events and the nature of the dynamic that had been launched by these two events. And these are events, and I call them events, although they are protracted events. They are events in that an event as distinct from happenstance or an anecdote is that it is part of a broader context. It is an instance of a context, and it is these contexts which I think are the most important things that ought to be looked at when we look at the issues of blasphemy, particularly blasphemy in Europe today, which incidentally is in one sense anachronistic, And in one sense, unusual because, contrary to expectations or to retrospective attitudes, there are not things which come, that is to say, the issue of blasphemy, nothing which comes naturally to Muslims qua Muslims. That is why, first of all, I want to speak briefly about commonplace explanations for the furor surrounding these particular affairs, the Salman Rushdie affair and the Charlie Hebdo affair. And these rest, in my view, upon cliches. There are cliches. The cliche is that there are salutary traditions to those who promote ideas of blasphemy and make charges of blasphemy, and a congenital incapacity for modernization and modernity by the adversaries. You have two parallel and incidentally, two images which really mirror each other. One, it is the propensity of Muslims to rebel in these circumstances is attributed to salutary traditions. On the other hand, that is to say, the opposite side would say, yes, these are salutary traditions perhaps, but they're not necessarily salutary because they betoken simply a congenital incapacity for life in a modern setting. First of all, the appeal to proof texts from the Quran or the Hadith are of no avail. They have no explanatory power. They don't really tell us about issues either of iconism and aniconism, that is to say, the displays of images of Muhammad as in the cartoons, or in the parodying of Muhammad as an entourage as in the novel. The Quran has no notion of blasphemy. Neither do other parts of what is regarded as the Muslim canon. Muslim jurisprudence, classical Muslim jurisprudence, has no equivalent category. The category of blasphemy does not exist. What has existed in the classical period are a variety of political actions against people who seem to be holding bizarre views on issues that connect to belief and dogma. But this is an extremely important matter which people seem to forget. There has been no Nicene Creed in the history of Islam. There is no regnant orthodoxy. There had been regnant orthodoxies which persisted for very, very short periods of time, a few decades at most, in the 9th century and again in the 11th. But otherwise, there has been no regnant orthodoxy as such until after the time of the Crusades. And it was indeed not formulated as such. What did exist in Muslim legal traditions were categories of unbelief and categories of apostasy, both of which, as a matter of fact, relate not so much to issues of religion, but to issues of sedition. So there had been a political definition of errant views, including what those holding errant views might say about dogmas, historical figures, and so on. But these were only evoked infrequently in a very scattered manner, each of which is subject actually to its own circumstances and to be understood only in the context of its circumstances. There had been rare executions along the centuries, but these had generally been quite rare. There's nothing as rigorous as the Catholic Inquisition. There had been due legal process, with the issue of recantation always being available for those who were willing to recant, and people were generally willing to recant. All these cases and the scripts and the execution scripts followed a particular pattern, but that pattern and the script was very rarely brought into action. So there was a pattern, but it was a pattern which was most of the time on the shelf. And most of the executions actually are generally cases quite akin to this ill-fated, unfortunate Thomas Aikenhead, who dangled from the end of a rope in Edinburgh in 1697, the last person to be executed for heresy in Britain, in Great Britain, as it were, who found himself in very unfortunate circumstances at the junction of a variety of dynamics taking place, and was not clever enough to be able to extricate himself from the ultimate punishment. That's number one. Secondly, classical Muslim jurisprudence, at least in the Arab world, if we exclude Saudi Arabia, and then states which then really made themselves into Islamic states, particularly Sudan, were simply an historical memory. They have very little effect on actual legislation. In the civil codes, which are the governing codes of Arab countries, certain older legislation arising from Muslim jurisprudence was usually incorporated under the title of customary practice, rather than as something which is divinely prescribed. That is, now if we exclude the personal status law, which is a different matter altogether. And secondly, the legal systems in place have no relevant prosecution agency or institution for issues that have to do with belief. And the one instance in which a person was executed for unbelief was when Sudan announced itself an Islamic state and launched the whole process of mounting political theater, the first act of which was that particular institution. But otherwise, in other places where such accusations had taken legal form, as in Egypt, for instance, in the case of Nasser Abu Zaid, this was actually freelancing judges who delivered judgments which did not actually exist in the civil code of the country and were therefore unenforceable. This is quite common in Egypt. As for Pakistan, this is a different question altogether. Laws inherited from the Raj, blasphemy laws inherited from the Raj, were then reinstated and made much more severe as the country was deliberately Islamized by the political system put in place by General Zia-ul-Haq. Right. And incidentally, any prosecutions that take place in Arab countries on issues which abut errancy of belief or blasphemy are usually expressed in terms of the civil law of libel. Right? There is no particular law of blasphemy or particular laws of blasphemy as still exists in Britain. For instance, David Nash knows more about this than anyone else, a body of law, a law which is just as difficult to use as it is difficult to reform. And it just stays where it has been staying in the past decades. Now, finally, the issue of visual traditions, that Muslims are by nature iconoclastic or averse to images. Of course, the idea of Bilderverbot, that is to say, the aversion to showing images of humans, the idea and the term were brought up in the 1860s with reference to a whole list of Semitic incapacities, including the incapacity for philosophy and rational thought, and so on, as a sign of alterity, anachronism, and medievalism. There's an excellent article about this by our dear colleague Barry Flood. There were often images of Muhammad available, but traditions and practices varied from place to place, and it is really this which is the governing pattern rather than a blanket ban. One finds, for instance, that some of the manuscripts that had images of Muhammad were effaced later on in the medieval period or the early modern period. Now, the interesting thing is that, of course, there is a very keen Muslim interest in the person of Muhammad. There are story portraits of him, story portraits, that is, books which purport to describe his appearance, not only his actions, but his appearance, down to the tiniest details. These then merged with a genre of praise literature called hilye in Turkish, and hilya, verbal images of Muhammad, which became very common in the late medieval and early modern period, and these were actually used apotropaically in Ottoman realms from around 1600. In Iran, these were actually accompanied by actual drawings. Esther, if we may see the image number 2, you will see here an image of Muhammad in full splendor, surrounded by a nimbus, on his passage up to heaven on Al-Buraq, his famous mount. There are splendid illuminations of Muhammad's biography in the great history of Rashiduddin, Jami' al-Tawarikh. If we may see number 3, please, Esther, which shows Muhammad being, it's almost an annunciation. This is about 1200. There's almost an annunciation image where we have Gabriel telling him that he'd been selected by God to deliver a particular message. And then we can see another one of these. Esther, number 4, please. And that is, here we have Muhammad on the right-hand side during the battle of Badr. Other conventions of portraying Muhammad, more or less the 14th and 15th centuries, show him, mainly Turkish ones rather than Persian, show him veiled. If we can see number 5, please. This is again Muhammad surrounded by a nimbus of fire, riding on his mount and going on his heavenly journey, but with a veiled face. Then, of course, we have much more modern things. For instance, if we can look at number 6, Esther, this is Muhammad after the image of Ali. This is a Persian image of Muhammad from the 20th century. And then, very interestingly, we have. Let me just bring in another one, image number 7. Again, this is the sort of image of Muhammad which circulated in Iran well into the 2000s, right? Written underneath Muhammad Rasulullah, Muhammad the apostle of God, with this famous cave behind him where he's supposed to have received his commission from God. Now, the interesting thing is that this image disappeared from Tehran Bazaars in 2009. You see, in 1905, 1906, there was a certain Rudolf Leonhardt and a certain Ernst Landrock who were doing Orientalist photography in Egypt and Tunisia. They circulated a photo in the 1920s, usually captioned Muhammad, but also captioned an Arab and his flower. May we see this image, please, Esther? It's number 8. This is from the National Geographic magazine, January 1914, directly transposed and duly transformed into an image. First of all, an image. This is a Tunisian. This is a comely Tunisian young man, right? The image was extremely popular in the 1920s, and then it was incorporated into the religious iconography of Iran very soon thereafter, and used, as I suggested, apotropaically. And of course, in Europe, Europe is not a stranger to portrayals of Muhammad. Medieval manuscripts contain lots of horrible pictures of him, lots and lots of horrible pictures of him. If we can see the famous image number 9 from San Petronio in Bologna, which is, you will see Muhammad to the left, above the left shoulder of Lucifer there, being tortured in the seventh circle of Dante's hell. This kind of things was really fairly standard. But then soon thereafter, from the 17th century onwards, we have a very different sense of Muhammad's appearance in European manuscripts and histories, where he appears as a statesman, as a sage, as a lawgiver, very much in tune with the broader changes in the image of Muhammad in Europe, including amongst Islamophiles at the radical wing of religious reforms. And indeed, he was very much humanized. There are very interesting things and plays and so forth. We even find him actually in a ball at Versailles, when it was still a hunting lodge, in 1626, if we may see image number 10. Entrée de Mahomet, the entry of Muhammad as performed during a ball at Versailles in 1626, when in the presence of Louis XIII. There is even a greater form of adulation if we were to jump a few centuries and jump continents and go to Washington, DC. If you may see image number 11. This is in the main hall of the US Supreme Court. The middle person is Muhammad. To his right is Charlemagne, and to his left is Justinian. This is a huge frieze in the US Supreme Court, 1931 to 1935, which shows a whole range of lawmakers across history, from Hammurabi, Moses to Grotius, Napoleon, and indeed the US Chief Justice, John Marshall. So there is nothing really very new about portrayals of Muhammad, be it to Muslims or to Europeans. And finally, what is important is actually not the act of representation, but the content and context of representation, to which I will come in just a couple of moments after I make a very brief comment on traditions. Now, the appeal to traditions, of course, the assumption is that Muslim traditions or historical traditions of Muslims are traditions of piety. I can assure you that they are equally traditions of impiety as they were traditions of piety. And the lived traditions of Muslim societies everywhere cannot be confined to textual, religious, and legal traditions. The idea of caricaturing all Muslims as super Muslims does not really work. It has no historical verisimilitude. It doesn't work at all. And these traditions are quite profane, with only scant prudery, very little actually compared to what one finds in earlier European traditions. And the idea that the ulama were venerated representatives of the people, again, makes no historical sense. The ulama have always been lampooned in very great measure, and a variety of works, some of them written by ulama themselves. And this tradition actually persists until today, where generally they have a reputation for greed, pedophilia, and backwardness, as a matter of fact. Portrayed as such in cartoons, if you may see number 12, Esther. This is a very recent Arab cartoon which shows us the ulama blind leading the blind to hell, right? And that they are the transmitters of superstitions, if we may see the next one, number 13, Esther, please. There you are, manipulating the ignorant. This is a very constant theme in Arab culture, be it medieval or modern. I mean, one can compare this in a certain way to a much more profound and pathetic image. If we see number 14, this is the famous witches' Sabbath of Goya, which has much of the same spirit, but of course transposed into a completely different artistic register. And finally, the idea that clerics trade in religion is really a very commonly received idea. If we may see number 15, please. There you are. This is this religious character is selling religion off a cart on the street. This is a very, very common kind of cartoon. One sees this every day. And one sees this particular mood, this particular idea in all manner of religious, of medieval writings. So, and this was also conjoined, actually, if one were to look at traditions, a variety of topoi, which were very widely circulated in the Middle Ages. Free-thinking commonplaces, mostly not particularly well developed, quite spontaneously said. First of all, that there is no sign of benign providence. The world is such a horrible place, and it's so unjust and so cruel. There cannot be a wise God managing it. Then, of course, a God who is needy does not really square with the idea of omnipotence. Needy because he likes the smell of burnt flesh, needy because he created the world in 6 days and needed to take a day of rest, and so on and so forth. These are kind of elementary questions which occurred all the time and everywhere, you know, reminiscent of something a little bit more lighthearted. If we may see number 16, Esther, please. So this is a recent American cartoon. This lady to the left of the little boy says, "I'm with him," that is to say, with the cross. And he says to her, "Aren't you a little old to have an imaginary friend?" So it is really this kind of very, very instinctive questioning of improbable ideas, which really was quite well circulated among medieval Arabs, medieval Muslims in general. We have much more elevated things like Al-Ma'arri's savage satire of the Muslim paradise, and he lived all his life in relative comfort and in a world of complete adulation and admiration. We can go to Al-Razi, for instance, who claimed that the books of Galen and Hippocrates were superior to the Quran, that the Quran's imagery is poor, that the ulama, on the appearance of their beards, are akin more to goats than to saintly figures, that God was simply a cosmological principle that had nothing to do with providence. If we may see the image of Razi, please, number 17. This is Razi in stained glass at the Princeton University Chapel, right? Sporting his very famous book of medicine, which was one of the most important medical texts of the Middle Ages. And then, of course, the idea by him and by Ibn al-Rawandi, another one. Razi, of course, was an extremely prosperous man, very famous, and served as personal physician to a succession of caliphs as well. I had no problem with these views. People had no problem with these views because first of all, there was no regnant orthodoxy, and secondly, religious culture was very much in competition with other cultural registers, which is quite often really forgotten by those who comment today. So the idea that prophets are basically political actors and manipulators was an idea which he put forward, Al-Razi, very, very clearly, and very many others as well, and that ultimately prophets are really more akin to impostors than to good people. The idea that the three main prophets, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, were impostors was an idea which really did circulate at that time, and then made its way through extremely interesting ways to Europe of the late 17th century and to this famous book, De Tribus Impostoribus, later published in French and made very, very famous. And incidentally, I'm actually doing a book on these motifs and the transmission of these motifs across times and across continents. The ulama were not hegemonic. Religious culture was not necessarily hegemonic. So much really for explaining the Rushdie affair and the Charlie Hebdo in terms of traditions. What I want to assert that Muslim protests in contemporary Europe were not so much related to what Muslim protesters were, but were related to what Muslim protesters were becoming. There was a dynamic of communalization, which to my mind is the communalization and corporatization of the European body politic, which was really the main dynamic behind the issues of blasphemy. So blasphemy has less to do with religion than with communalism. The instrumentalization of rage is a process which draws boundaries of a social involution fed by a persistent sense of alienation. Now, what I'm maintaining is that these Muslim communities which have been involved, and they are not all Muslims actually who have been involved in this, right? Have been going through a process of resocialization, new social and religious habitus, which had been inculcated through this process by a number of nameable and identifiable actors. Nameable and identifiable actors on the global level. So the history of blasphemy is the history really of communalization. And for this, there have been very vigorous pushbacks. At the beginning, hesitant, now much more energetic. Pushbacks, including the revival of religious sentiment in Europe, a new emphasis on what has commonly been called the Judeo-Christian heritage, which really as an historical category corresponds to nothing that we know in history. Basically, Judaism and Islam are very close together, and closer than either of them to Christianity in actual terms. And the rise and near hegemony of right-wing ideologies and political actors. So what I'm maintaining is that there has been a process of communalization, which through the Rushdie affair and thereafter built upon Islamic self-stigmatization in terms of bizarre forms of dress, in terms of facial expressions, in terms of tonalities with which special pleading is delivered, amplified by sociopathic and ultimately terrorist action, exulting in the act and in the exhibition of the act. And incidentally, let me just emphasize, terrorism is not something which touches Europeans alone. In fact, in the broader scheme of things, it is people in Muslim countries who are actually more, who have suffered more, both in terms of actual disruption and in terms of figures of carnage, if we may see image number 18. And this is a very recent Arab cartoon, if you would care to look at it. There we go. This kind of cartoon is really quite common in the Arabic press. Now, alongside this, of course, this has been a process in which Islamophobia had been constructed. And by Islamophobia, I don't mean the rhetorical sense of Islamophobia. as a blanket defensive or apologetic term, as it is often used. I mean by it a real sense of fear, not from vicarious prejudice, as had been the case with anti-Semitism, but because of actual, tangible, and demonstrable threats across European territories, coming from actors with claims to legal and political extraterritoriality, and really a savage sense of identity as one which betokens complete separation. This has nothing to do with ancestralism. The Muslims who have been susceptible to this have been going through a process of re-socialization. Imagine, even in 2005, when the troubles in the banlieues of Paris took place, Sarkozy was talking of canaille, of scoundrels and ruffians, not about Islamists. Today, when something equivalent happens, it's always Islamists who are indicated, irrespective of whether they have been involved or not. Now, Charlie Hebdo, I will now go rather quickly through some of the material. Charlie Hebdo, as you know, is very well known, a satirical magazine with quite often very bad taste, sometimes juvenile, often funny, very scurrilous and really savage, which spares no one. The first victim was de Gaulle on the day of his death, and that was when Charlie Hebdo started. Catalans, the Catholic Church and Christianity, Jews, Judaism, Corsicans, a succession of French presidents, also Erdogan, very recently, Queen Elizabeth and Meghan Markle, the Italy earthquake, migrants in general. Bad taste, sometimes very funny. Sometimes, it's really hit and miss. With a general disparagement of religion. If you look at image number 19, for instance, we have Christ at the Last Supper, and it's called Le Dîner de Cons. That is to say, a dinner for idiots. The title is taken from a rather funny French film now with the same title in 1998. If we may see number 20, this is the way in which Orthodox Jews are parodied. He's being told, you can shave your brain, but you may not shave your side locks, right? This is very Charlie Hebdo. If we may see the next one, please. There's a general assault of religion. Le retour des anti-lumières, the return of the anti-enlightenment, and you have a bishop and a Muslim blowing away lights. Again, this is really a very, very Charlie Hebdo. Now, incidentally, only 1.3%, someone has made a tally, 1.3% of Charlie Hebdo's covers have been connected to Islamic themes. So Islamic themes are really a matter of course. It's not something really very special that they do. If we may look at the issue on terrorism in 2006, now image number 22, Mahomet débordé, Muhammad overwhelmed, as it were. He's saying it's hard to be loved by idiots, right? That's what he's saying of himself, given a number of matters which that number was commenting upon, particularly manners of dress and so on. And then, of course, after that, they republished the posters of Jyllands-Posten, the Danish one, in solidarity. If we may see number 23. This is the most famous of these Jyllands-Posten cartoons of Muhammad as a ticking bomb. Then in 2011, the offices of Charlie Hebdo were firebombed, as a result of which Charlie Hebdo produced another issue. If we may see image 24. It's called Sharia Hebdo instead of Sharia Hebdo. They appointed Muhammad as editor-in-chief for that particular issue. And he is saying here, 100 lashes of the whip if you don't die of laughter, right? So they were provoking, and they were also reacting in a very, very characteristic manner. In January 2015, there was the famous gun attack on the offices of Charlie Hebdo by the Kouachi brothers, who then killed really the basic actors, the editor-in-chief and the main cartoonist and so on. As a result of which, incidentally, the distribution jumped from 60,000 per issue to 3 million per issue, with the revenues given to the families of those who were lost. But then Charlie Hebdo offered forgiveness and friendship in its own way, if we may see number 25. Tout est pardonné. All is forgiven. I am Charlie Hebdo, which was the title of the anti-murder mobilization. And then they ironized amity, if we may look at the next one, please. Esther, number 26. Love is stronger than hatred, right? So you have Muslims and Charlie Hebdo embracing, or perhaps more than embracing. And until the last episode was, of course, on the 16th of October 2020, when Samuel Paty, a school teacher at Conflans Sainte-Honorine outside Paris, 25 kilometers outside Paris, was killed by a stalker who had wanted to kill him. And apparently the whole thing had been orchestrated on the social media with little justification. The reason given was that he had shown images of the Charlie Hebdo Muhammad in discussion groups, and what was clear was that this had been done without any problems for a period of 5 years. So there was actually a very, very deliberate type of action took place. Now, what we get from this is that the issue was not the cartoons as such, but the context of their evocation, not of their publication, of their evocation by outsiders. When this kind of material is circulated outside the natural social constituency of circulation by particular actors. And again, in this case, everything is really quite clear. Because, you know, if it were a matter of the image itself, then if we look at another image, then that should really have been much more grievous. If we may look at number 27, assassin, again, a Charlie Hebdo assassin. The assassin is God, right? It's not Muhammad. It's not some Muslim. It is God himself who is portrayed as the assassin behind all assassins. There has been hardly a word about this particular one. So again, it's a question of deliberate cultivation of rage and offense. And in the case of Charlie Hebdo, particularly outside France, extremely strong anti-French tones, particularly in the Anglo-American press, which is generally given to craven virtue signaling in situations such as this, and among Arabs, basically by Islamists and cultural nationalists who had engaged actually in a kind of almost a gloating polemic against the very idea of the Republic in circumstances which are carried at the moment, in contrast to the case with the Rushdie affair, by virtual crowds operated by what people in the IT business call homophilous sorting. That is to say, the construction of virtual communities of interest and of affection, which cuts out contrary opinions. We've seen this very clearly in, for instance, in the United States during the Trump presidency, and which allows people who are separated physically to act as a mob according to the definition of the crowd that we find in authors such as Le Bon, Unamuno, or Canetti, right? We have actually virtual crowds, and this person who killed Samuel Paty party acted as a member of a virtual crowd. The atmosphere is extremely tense, and the right is very important in France, and also what you might call the alt-right, the alt-intellectual right of France, with Eric Zemmour and quite a number of others, in which everybody seems to be participating. If we may look at image 28, a famous Islam expert, was listened to by a succession of French presidents, now publishes a book, Le Prophète et la Pandémie, the Prophet and the Pandemic, which is in fact extremely cheap provocation of those who are the victims of the various forms of legislation. Now, finally, my view is that the new Islam laws that resulted from the Samuel Paty assassination are a little bit late, because we find the French state reintroducing a form of social engineering long after social engineering had ceded place to the market, which transformed social disadvantage from socioeconomic disadvantage and from social segmentation to a register of culture and religion. Finally, I don't have very much time left. Let me just go on to the satanic verses, if we may see image number 29. This is the moment of triumph in 1989, when the book was published and received the prize. It's it's a global novel par excellence, which I enjoyed, but it does use all the tricks of the trades of satire, irony, and blasphemy to satirize Muhammad and his entourage. Now, once again, the content in itself is not important. People said that people were objecting who hadn't read it. Reading or not reading, in my view, is in that particular register irrelevant. What was important really was the mobilization. And in my view, I believe, there's quite a lot to be said about this, but I believe that this was the opportunity which crystallized a variety of the activities of a variety of infrastructural facilities, not yet, of infrastructural facilities that were made available, starting with the Cold War, and then continuing the building of an international network, very, very well financed by Saudi Arabia, and a little bit by Libya, a little bit by Iran, but mostly of Saudi Arabia, which worked on proselytization and re-socialization of Muslims worldwide, including those in Europe, in the specific case of the United Kingdom, with the Rushdie affair, and subsequently, the main actors have been a specific Pakistani political party, which has turned peasants into urban Muslims with special kinds of dress and language and body language and locutions and social habitus. And I must add also the social services, and very importantly, the Labour Party, which used traditional leaders, or rather reinstated and manufactured traditional leaders in various parts of Britain, particularly in the north and in East London, as brokers of votes for the Labour Party. So in return for actually enforcing a type of identitarian, communalist, separatist, ghettoizing communities which act and which figure as closed voter banks, under the control of these entrepreneurs who are leaders or who became leaders as a result of the satanic affairs. I mean, people often claim that, you know, it's well known that Muslims will behave in this way, right, and will react in this way, and that Salman Rushdie really ought not to have published the book because he should have known better. I can assure you that he didn't, and I can assure you it was quite unexpected. I remember Mary Warnock at that time also started to comment on something which had been incipient at that time, that is to say, Muslim women covering their heads. Today, of course, there are more burqas in Bradford than there are in Damascus. You know, the dynamic is very clear, and I watched it at close hand. And I must say, I was a partisan during that time. Michael Ignatieff spoke at the beginning. He hosted me on the BBC Two, The Late Show, one Sunday, together with the novelist Ian McEwan. And I did have lunch with Mr. Rushdie 3 days, as a matter of fact, before he had to disappear at Groucho's Club in London. And he told me this whole thing had been unexpected, and as far as he was concerned, it was an unexpected bonus. Well, that was before the fatwa. The famous fatwa was pronounced. But generally, let me go back to one thing that I said before I close. Much of the was concerned with what is naturally given to anyone who is a Muslim. That is to say, there is a doctrine of congenital incapacities which came into play at virtually every single stage of this debate. And of course, it was also a chance for a variety of religious lobbies to come together against this particular book, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish as well. There's quite a lot of detail. I don't think we need to go into it at that moment, at this very present moment. The last thing is this idea of Muslim rage. If one were to want to look at Muslim rage, as it was called at the time, or the internal temper of militant wrath, as it was put by one firebrand at that time, the first question to ask is whose rage? And who defines that which enrages? And who defines that which, the consequence to which rage is to be the consequences of rage. It can only happen on the assumption that Islam is, or all Muslims might be reduced to an indistinct mass of fanatics, an idea accepted both by advocates of this particular type of Islam and by their adversaries. Do I have any more time, Nadia, or am I finished?
Well, in terms of the clock, there is no more time, but I think you should have 2 minutes to wrap up if you want to.
Thank you. So let me just say again that the notion of blasphemy in the archaic form in which it is circulating today is a set piece in a psychodramatic political theater with actors, right? And this political theater has the purpose of corporatizing the European body politic, starting with one particular component. It involves resocialization. It involves also the construing of a particular image of Muslims in Europe. The generally received image now, as I said, it started with Muslim self-stigmatization, provoked all kinds of pushbacks. You know, in 1895, at the end of the 19th century, there was quite a discourse about degeneration. There was fear that that stock was really becoming degenerate, that the proletariat, which was a lower order, was becoming much too prominent. There was a certain sense of malaise at that time, and a certain sense of, very strong sense of decadence and decline at that fin de siècle. And at that time, in 1895, H.G. Wells published a very interesting novel called The Time Machine, which travels a few 100,000 years into the future and then finds that humanity has become two different species. The white-skinned, weak ones on top, and then the Morlocks underneath, who prey on them, cultivate them, feed them, and eat them. A film actually was made in 1960, if we may see image number 30. These are the Morlocks, right? The subterranean Morlocks. Now, I have a very strong suspicion that this type of imagery, or the impression that one gathers from this type of imagery, can also be gathered from images of Muslim riots, if we may see image number 31. This is chosen at random. There are thousands of those images, be they from Pakistan or from Britain. So there is really a very, very strong sense of internal bifurcation, a very strong sense of internal bifurcation, and I will really like to evoke the Communist Manifesto of 1848, which starts with evoking a specter haunting Europe, and we do have now another specter haunting Europe in this particular form. Let me just end by reading one short paragraph from an article I wrote for the New Statesman on the 20th of January, 1989, in which I said, "At issue, therefore, are political questions of authority. What is at issue is who represents Muslims and who speaks in their name on a range of questions, including separatist sectarian education, intermarriage, ghettos in which increasingly odd manners of dress and norms of behavior are observed, and affiliation to archaic politics in Pakistan, India, and Saudi Arabia. The claim to represent Muslims is in fact spurious. Few Muslims, even practicing ones, are Islamists in cultural or political terms, although in Britain as elsewhere, few are willing to contest the issue with cantankerous activists backed by deep and well-endowed coffers. In fact, this kind of political and cultural zealotry is very new in Muslim history, which only emerged from an insignificant subculture when its patrons, from some of the most archaic groups in the Muslim world, became particularly and spectacularly rich after the oil boom. Now, of course, this trend appears to have been accomplished." Thank you very much.